I'm proud to introduce our first expert speaker today, Dr. Alyse Price-Tobler, who joins me here online. Alyse, thank you for making the time to be part of this discussion. For those that haven't met Dr. Alyse Price-Tobler before, she's a clinical psychotherapist, so PAC for registered, with 30 plus years experience in disabilities and specialised mental health. She has twin doctorates. I do not know where you get the time, Alyse, but her first PhD is in adult survivors of severe level child psychological, physical and sexual abuse. And your second PhD is specialised in mental health practitioners and the treatments used with adult survivors. Alyse is also an academic child abuse researcher, expert and author. I know you have authored a couple of books. Also an adult child survivor of severe level parental alienation and abduction yourself. And I understand, Alyse, you're currently writing the world's first treatment protocol for mental health practitioners working with clinically and adult survivors of psychological abuse. Alyse, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Alyse, if I can just jump straight into it, Alyse, what is parental alienation? That's what we're talking about here today, but I'm really interested. What's your view? What is parental alienation?
Well, parental alienation, that term is a term, it's a layperson's term, it's a euphemism that we use out with the general public. It's not a term that we use in clinical psychology. Clinical psychology, we use the term child psychological abuse and spousal abuse. So they're a little bit different. Parental alienation is the popular term. So we use both depending on who we're speaking to.
Okay. And what's your position on that child psychological abuse or parental alienation? Is it evidence-based? Can people educate themselves in this? Where do we start?
Yeah, well, I think we need to go back a little bit to 1969 when, and I've just got to grab my glasses for a sec. In 1969, Governor Ronald Reagan of California made what he called one of the biggest mistakes of his political life. Seeking to eliminate the deception and conflict associated with the legal system of fault-based divorces, Reagan signed America's first no-fault divorce bill. The new law gave couples the go-ahead to pursue a divorce without proving any fault on either side, essentially gutting marriage and its legal power to bind together a husband and a wife. And it's estimated that if the United States of America had maintained their family levels of stability, much like in the 1960s, there would be approximately 70,000 fewer suicide attempts every year. So currently 3.8 million, and this was back in 2019, children were suspected of experiencing mild to moderate child psychological abuse, also known by lay people as parental alienation, by one of their parents in America. In addition, the divorce industry was estimated to be $50 billion, worth $50 billion annually in the US. That was in 2014. Now we've hit about $80 billion per year, which is what the high conflict divorce industry is making off high conflict divorce and families going through the systems. So just interestingly, it's just like they said that historically there's approximately 100,000 custody battles taking place in the US. That was in 2000. So can you imagine what the stats would be now? So we've got this is when this no fault divorce came in, a lot started to happen.
Wow, those numbers are staggering. And that, if I bring this back, that's a lot of children that are caught in the middle, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And the clinical definition of parental alienation at a clinical level, adult child psychological abuse involves a child getting drawn into their parents' marital conflict by forming a coalition with the allied parent against the other parent. And this alliance leads to a breakdown in the child's relationship with the targeted parent. And usually, that parent, we're looking at a pathology with a narcissistic or borderline parent using the child to manage their own anxiety stemming from the divorce, essentially reversing the parent child roles to ease their own distress. So we've got a lot of pathology within the family court system, and we need a lot more psychoeducation to be going on out there with all the professionals who are trying to work in this really difficult, high conflict, and often violent space.
Alyse, you mentioned about pathology. Other guest speakers that we've had have used the word enmeshment or enmeshed. Could you help us understand what that means in relation to that pathology as well?
Yeah, so if I go back a little bit, I suppose an important aspect to understand about high conflict custody litigation from a clinical psychology perspective is a high conflict custody litigation indicates the presence of a high conflict personality pathology in a parent. So a no normal range parent puts their child through a high conflict custody battle in the family court because normal range parents have empathy for the child and they realize that the destructive impact that would have on the child. So they don't tend to end up in the family court system. So this pathology drives it into the family court system because there's a lot going on in there that's not understood. It's actually in the wrong system a lot of the time that needs to, if we see this high conflict pathology, needs to be moved out into the mental health system. So it's very interesting. Yeah, so that parent's usually absent of empathy, and we generally look at the narcissistic, borderline, or dark, or they often have a dark personality. So if the mere presence of high conflict custody litigation in the courts, that indicates either a narcissistic personality pathology, and that pathology is vulnerable to rejection, which the divorce creates as a narcissistic injury and a desire for revenge in a lot of the cases. So they're highly vengeful and they need to self-stabilize this personality. So they'll incorporate the child. It's what we call a regulatory object to counter the narrative with I'm not the rejected one, you are, and you rejected me. So they bring the child in to fill that wound. And it's a very complex space. And that's where we lead into the enmeshment. So measurement of a child, that's a pretty hard place to be for the children to be used as regulatory objects for parents. And it's a bit of a long kind of thing, the enmeshment, so I can speak to it if you want to, and
I think so, because there's a couple of questions already flowing in. And for everyone listening, please use the link in the chat or that you have access to there in the room in Newcastle. Please send your questions in because we will be addressing your questions. But there's a couple of comments about that enmeshment. You mentioned the word layman's terms before. Could you help? I know you're a clinical psychotherapist, but could you help us understand the basics of what does that enmeshment look like?
So I'm just going to find a little bit that I just want to say here that a lot of my work is drawn from Dr. Craig Childress's work. He's been my clinical supervisor for the past 5 years, and I read everything there is, and I have twin PhDs in this subject as well. A lot of the stuff that we talk about comes from a lot of his work. So he's also training me to do second opinion diagnosis at the moment. So I just want to reference him at this point. And he's a pretty controversial figure, that's for sure. But at this point, like I said, I'm an adult child of this stuff, and I'm a clinical psych. So I'm pretty good at figuring out who's who in the zoo and which works for me in clinical practice and how that works. So enmeshment enmeshment is a very interesting thing. We're looking at the attachment systems of the children in this case, and a lot of the time, how they do this is they will miss a tune with the child. So the particular people that we're seeing in the family court system, a lot of the time, they don't have children to meet the child's needs. They have children to meet their own needs. So they don't, I hear statements coming from allied parents such as, if I have a child, it'll never leave me again and I'll never be alone. And they don't like children to have autonomy. They don't like children to have their own voices. Basically, in an enmeshed relationship, that parent is the sun and the children are the planets that revolve around them. It's a family and domestic violence situation. It's coercive control. And often the targeted parent, who was once in here as the spouse, will have been caught up in that to a degree as well. And this allied parent, the one that we're looking at in the family court system, they're often wanting everybody to be there for them and fill all their needs. And if they don't, we'll see a very different presentation within that parent, and one that's can be very overt or it can also be very subtle. So children who grow up in this environment, and I can speak from experience, when we have a parent who's coercively controlling us for a secondary gain, which is what we call it, for their own need and using us as a regulatory object, we have to calm them down. We have to settle them. We have to regulate them all the time. If we look out and we want to go and, explore the world and be our own people, they don't particularly like that. They want us to be little mini versions of them. And we're trained that when we go out, we have to come back in whenever they need us, whenever they want us. We're always focused on them. And this is why we run into trouble when there's a divorce, separation, because the targeted parent is now seen as not aligning with this allied parent. So they're on the outs, and now they become the monster, the whatever. And so it's in the allied parent, all they want to do is keep the children all to themselves to settle themselves down. And it's a very, very complex area. And in this space, we see a lot of the false allegations starting. And we're looking at spousal abuse. So sometimes we're hearing the allied parent making false accusations of spousal abuse, domestic violence, child psychological abuse, child sexual abuse. We see these. And this is where we need to get good as mental health professionals working in the court system. If we see any of these flags, if we see any kind of abuse, we quickly need to figure out who is the abusive parent, or is it both of them? Is there child psychological abuse going on, which in the DSM-5 is the V995.54. That's what any mental health practitioners need to be looking up, because we've got a big fight on our hands where everyone's going, parental alienation needs to be in the DSM-5, but it's already actually in there. So if we look, and then if there's an allegation of child sexual abuse, which is V995.53, child neglect, V995.52, or child psychological abuse, V995.51, this is what we hone in on. This is what we look at. So, and then we need to send it out into the mental health system. A child who is rejecting a safe, loving, and emotionally available parent, that's not normal. We don't see that anywhere in the animal world. If we had an animal out there who was, say, the father went out to hunt and kill and was left with the mother, and the mother just left that animal there, they would be picked off and killed. So what these parents do, allied parents, is they keep us very close to them and they miss a tune with us. So if we want something, they won't attune to our needs. So if we're children, babies, we need a bottle because we're very, very thirsty, hungry, whatever it is, will like cry out. They need to attune to us. But these particular no empathy or low empathy parents, and empathy can be taught to some degree, and sometimes that's why what we need to do in this space is teach the parents empathy, because they might not have had it as children, and to attune to the children. So we've got a lot going on in here. And when the child gets older, by misattuning with the child keeps seeking attention, trying to get the parent to tune back into them. Because when we have a parent tune into us, we feel safe, we feel loved, we feel it's amazing. It's like the sun shining on us. But allied parents who are in the family court system, they misattune to the children, which is the psychological abuse. So the children are often on the back foot, and we're often begging and pleading for attention from them. And we're very likely to be enmeshed with them because we're still trying to get that safety. This is our attachment networks we're talking about. So if there's any mucking around going on with the child's attachment networks, and they are being told your parent's scary without any actual abuse going on, we've got a very serious problem. And this is what's not being seen in the courts.
Wow. So the breaking the child out of that enmeshed bond actually disrupts the new means that they get their needs met. In when you talked about that orbit, that's what they've become used to. Alyse,
Yep.
we have got questions and comments flowing in just after just a short introduction to what you've introduced us to. I'm going to ask a larger question. What changes are required, or where do you see that we should start to address this?
We really need the mental health professionals and the court professionals to all start to see the red flags. And one of the red flags is when a child says, I'm scared of that parent, or I don't want to go with that parent, I want to stay with this one. That's not normal. Normal range parents, children in normal relationships are allowed to see their other parent. They want to see them. And a normal range parent would be like, of course. Let's make time for that to happen. A child who is being used as a regulatory object and having their attachment networks mucked around with, and in psychological abuse, these children stick very close to the allied parent. And to an untrained professional in a room, it looks like they have this really amazing close bond and wonderful relationship. But then they say things to us like, but I don't want to see my other parent because I'm scared. And weak, frivolous excuses is one of the other things that they give us. And often we'll be listening for adult lines that children talk about. He was awful to my mother. He was psychologically and physically abusing her, from a 5-year-old. It's kind of like, right, so we need to be trained up in what to look for. And then as soon as we see that, we're mandatory reporters. So interestingly, are lawyers, magistrates, medical doctors, like all of us, we're all basically on the front, who work on the front line in this field, we're all mandatory reporters. So we're really well trained in identifying sexual abuse and physical abuse, but how we and a lot of the time neglect, but how are we at identifying psychological abuse, which in the research actually says is worse than all the other abuses. And then we've got children who are being weaponized into spousal abuse. So these children are not only aligned and enmeshed with one parent, but they're also being taught that the other parent's dangerous, and they're now weaponized against the other parent. And that's spousal abuse, and we've got to call it like it is.
Alyse, right now today, we have parents joining us, we have professionals. So I see we have some legal professionals, some from the psychology. So the people you were just speaking to, what can our audience that are watching this do about this right now, whether we're a parent or a professional? You did mention that we need to change by seeing the red flags, but is there one pragmatic first step that you could give the broader audience of what can we do right now?
We need the mental health professionals who work in this field of child abuse to get really good at identifying the child psychological abuse systems and the pathology, I mean. And they need to be very, there's a lot involved in this space. They can't just be custody litigation like it's this parent's the better parent than the other parent. That can't be going on. We've got to really have a much, much deeper understanding, especially all of the custody evaluators, the lawyers. They need to be able to um, notice this and flag it because they're mandatory reporters. So that needs to go straight out. If they're seeing any of these things, we need them to start reporting, and then they will get another evaluation and it will be off their hands. If they don't report child psychological abuse when they're seeing a child who's scared of another parent and it's not analyzed to see what kind of abuse it is, they're kind of contributing to the child abuse. And I'm really hardcore on this, and it's going to be very controversial, but this is how I feel. And if they're going to work in this industry with children in high conflict divorce with these really dark personalities and difficult personality pathologies, they need to become much better trained.
Well, it's funny you say that because we've already got questions coming in about training for legal professionals and others. So we'll come to that in the Q&A that's coming up in this session. Alyse, I think the final question I'd like to ask you, you mentioned your dad, you mentioned your own experience. I know it's a personal question, but do you mind sharing with us why this is so important? You are so passionate, you are so knowledgeable in this space, but why is this important to you in relation to your own relationship with your dad?
Yeah. Well, as a young child, my father left us. He was very young, in his 20s, got married to my mother. She had 3 children under 3. My mother has a very serious background, never diagnosed. And I need to say to everyone, the traumas that are presenting in the family court, a lot of them with these high conflict divorce parents, they've got a lot of childhood trauma that's unresolved. So we need to have some compassion for them in that space. So I won't go into my mum's too much, but she has a pretty hardcore childhood. She went to boarding school at age 12. Stuff happened. Then she went into nursing. When she was 18, she basically never went home. So she has a lot of abandonment stuff. So when my father and she got married in their very early 20s, had 3 kids under 3, and he went off and did a few things that he shouldn't have done, and he admits that with a couple of other people. That caused a narcissistic injury that stuck with my mother and is still there and has never been worked on, and she has not done any work on herself. Then what happens is she brings in the 3 children, and we are now her regulatory objects. So living with a parent who's in that space. And then she was also had a lot of persecutory delusional stuff going on. So we would be privy to that. We would hear it. We would be part of that. And a lot of the time when you're being told that from a parent, you're sharing in the delusion. So we've got a bit of factitious disorder imposed on another happening. We've got shared delusional disorder with the child. We've got spousal abuse. So we've got all these things going on that nobody ever noticed. And then it wound up, and she got a lot of alliances, and then changed our names and moved us all interstate. So we were abducted. And then I did not see my father from the age of 8 through till 30. That's why I work in this space, and then it never stopped. That narrative, we were in danger, he's dangerous, blah, blah, blah. But the whole time it's very hard because, like, I knew my father and I loved my father. So you're being told all this stuff. It's not true, but everybody believed the stories that were being told. And if the mental health professionals or the school professionals had stepped forward and said, hey, why are these kids going to so many different schools? Why are these kids alone all the time? Where's the father? And why are they so terrified? And why aren't they talking to anyone? If someone had done a report on us, we would have been in the system and potentially it would have been noticed. So that's why I'm saying we're all mandatory reporters. That's why I study this, because I've lived it. I'm in my 50s and it doesn't stop. Okay, it doesn't stop. Once you turn 18, the pathological parent is still in your life. You still have to go to weddings, funerals. They're still trying to poison you against the other parent. It doesn't stop. So we have to get better at identifying it, assessing it, diagnosing it, treating it, and then trying to get it out of the court system.
Well, the comments rushing in are showing a lot of gratitude for your passion and drawing some purpose from your pain. And I want to say thank you. We are going to come back to you, Alyse. There's a lot of questions that we'd like to put back to yourself in the Q&A later on in this session. Thank you so much. Thank you for, I know it's only a short period of time there, but I think we need to expand on some of those topics based on the comments and questions coming in. So thank you. We'll come back to you in the Q&A. Thanks, Alyse.